We welcome you back again today to another Bible study here in the book of Mark, and also a chance to share a little bit from South Florida, where we're visiting right now, but also kind of keeping in mind my church family back home. I want to share just a few thoughts with you. We were looking at how Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration. And then when he came down, of course, he found the child who was possessed by a devil, and Jesus was able to cast him out. The disciples eventually came to him and said, "Why couldn't we cast him out?" That's verse 28. And I want to just quickly, in passing, just remind you of what he said in verse 29. "This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting." And sometimes we can focus on one or the other. And at least in my experience, it's easy for us to miss one or the other. Sometimes even when we're trying to fast, it may be easy for us to get busy with other things. And yes, we're fasting, but we're not really focused on prayer and fasting. And that's really a focus on trying to get that combination there together. So at this point, we needed to focus on both of those together. And let me just remind you, it can, fasting, obviously, we might think that is some grand, glorious thing. Maybe not so glorious, but at least a grand thing in our spiritual well-being. And in the process of that, then we maybe miss even the little steps that are important. And so even if it's not food necessarily, maybe some of you that are you have health issues, that makes it difficult for you. At least we can sacrifice something to go along with prayer and ask God to really give His power and presence. So anyway, that's a quick little nugget there in verse 29. But then you go on a little bit further, and Jesus begins to tell them, "I'm going to soon be crucified." And they don't even really want to ask Him. Verse 32 tells about that. They were afraid to ask Him. And so, almost like they don't really even want to focus on what He might be really saying. Well, then in verse 33, we come to a verse that maybe we ought to take to heart pretty often. And that issue is when Jesus puts His finger right on the problem spot. And, it's easy for us to make all sorts of excuses. And we try to bluff our way with this person or with that person. But sometimes He just puts His finger right on the sore spot. And He says, "What about that issue?" And notice there in verse 33, He said, "What was it that ye disputed among yourselves by the way?" He's talking to His disciples, saying, what were you talking about? What were you disputing about? And you can almost imagine suddenly they get a little sheepish. Let's not talk about that. I don't really want to have to deal with that in verse 34, but they held their peace. And you can about imagine they're just thinking, I don't really want to answer this. And then it says, "For by the way, they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest." You go back just a few verses and remember what Jesus is saying is going to happen. He says, "I'm going to be dying. I'm going to be killed. I'll rise the third day." They were afraid to even deal with that. They didn't even want to touch that issue because it was so troubling. But then they're saying, "Well, who's going to be the greatest?" He just said, "I'm going to be the servant of all." So much to the point that I'll give my life. And now they're saying, "I wonder which one of us could be the greatest." And when Jesus put His finger on the issue, in this case, we might say the pride or self-exaltation. And when you start to get into that, that really, it should make them sheepish. And yet maybe it's what God would want to start speaking to us about. Maybe it's the issue of pride, but might be something else. And sometimes we need to recognize that God can so clearly and carefully put His finger right on the heart of the issue that if sometimes we could really recognize His voice to our hearts, we would have to think, I don't really want to answer that. I'm embarrassed about that. I know I shouldn't have been having those lofty dreams, or of course in the area of pride, or I know I shouldn't have been even focused on that distraction or whatever it may be. And so then Jesus moved on, even though he knew what they were disputing. They didn't want to tell him. But then he begins to tell them, if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom, you need to be a servant. You need to be able to be like a child. He brought the child to him, verse 36, and kind of encouraged them to be like a child. And in this case, of course, he's referring to even the way they would treat children. So that's a part of that as well. But I think you can find it also in the Gospels where he's saying, you must be childlike. And even here, the other connection being a servant. And so may God help us to really recognize these several issues here today. I know it's just sort of a quick run through, but I want us to be thinking about that, because someday Jesus will prove to us that he knows every thought. He knows what we were talking about. He knows the disputing, if we sometimes had that, as far as, debating who's going to be the greatest. He knows all about it, and he can put his finger exactly where there's a need. And you and I need to be so careful that we are allowing God to show us that need, and that we're willing to answer. We're willing to say, yes, Lord, that's me. I know I really responded wrong, or I know that my focus has been off. And maybe he would just say, what about you? Are you focused on things that are not really important, or maybe should not be in your priorities? But are you like a child? Are you willing just to be taught as a child? Are you willing for God to just put his finger on certain things and say, nope, you need to make an adjustment here, you need to make an adjustment there? That's a natural parent that would kind of guide and direct. And different times I'll be speaking to my son, and this may lead to that, and so you need to make an adjustment here, and let's get back on track. And so may God help us to let him speak to our heart, that once in a while maybe nobody else even knows about it. In this case, it seems like it was at least a little bit public, at least the 12 disciples. But sometimes nobody else may know about it. But just suddenly in our innermost thoughts, we recognize, oh, yeah, I see. That's the way I feel. That was my motive. That was what was going on. It's because he's saying, what was it? What was it right there? He puts his finger on the issue. And so today, I want to just encourage you, be open to God. Just let him show you what he really wants you to do. And may God be so close, and his voice, that whisper from heaven, be just exactly what we need to help us realize, I see. That's what I've been doing. And so God help you today, and God help me. May we each one really be able to respond as God says, what about this? What about that? Maybe it's even in this area of fasting we talked about at the beginning. Maybe it's in the area of pride. Maybe in something totally different. Maybe even kindness, which is kind of what comes through in verse 37. But whatever it is, that God would just have the preeminence. He would be able to put his finger on our lives to draw us closer to him. Well, God bless you this week. We'll hope to be back with you again before too long.